for taking the time for this webinar.
नहीं, बहुत शुक्रिया Ali. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
No, it's our pleasure, and the reason I'm highlighting that again is 5 o'clock in the morning for Atif. It's 1 o'clock here in London, and of course it's 5 o'clock in Pakistan. So I'm very glad that Atif ne ek odd time per time nikala ye karne ke liye. So Atif, you are the host, and I know you have a great presentation which you have made for this webinar. This webinar is being live webcasted on KSB's website. It's also live on PSX website, and the recording of this webinar will be available on ksb.com and ksb.blogs. Atif has also done a class module for KSB's the online course, which is on ksb at teachable.com. So with that, Atif, over to you. Please run us through your presentation on financial statement analysis. किस तरह करते हैं, कौन से important variables देखने चाहिए, कौन से ratios understand करने चाहिए, और मोर इम्पोर्टेंटली मैंने आपकी प्रेजेंटेशन देखी है, आपने बहुत अच्छे एक सेक्शन आपकी रिपोर्ट में कि अकाउंटिंग रेड फ्लैग्स किस तरह होते हैं, और जो आपने एग्जांपल्स कोट की है दुनिया भर से कि किस तरह कंपनीज कभी के बाद मैनिपुलेट करती है अर्निंग्स को, और इन्वेस्टर्स को क्या क्या चीजें देखनी चाहिए. सो ओवर टू यू विद दैट. एंड जस्ट बिफोर दैट, I'll tell my co-host for this webinar is Arsalan Samro. I'll have to leave for a meeting, and Arsalan will take over and he will moderate the Q&A. Which will be after Atif's presentation. So over to you with that, Atif.
So thank you very much, Ali. So आप जब बात हुई थी, तो I wanted to create a presentation which was sort of creating a level ground for a lot of people. So my understanding is that some people who are watching this, they are well, retail investors, but some may be less experienced than others, and so what I wanted to do, and I'll quickly walk you through the agenda. The agenda is actually first to just go through the main structure of the financial statements. I know for some of you this might be very basic, but I'm a big believer of actually going back to the basics and really understanding. And to be honest, till this day, I think I learn a whole lot just going back to basics sometimes. So what I'm going to go do is just basically walk through some very fundamentals about the financial statement so that you understand what it is that we're trying to look at when we're looking at one. Once I've walked you through that, I'll just go through basic financial statement analysis. Again, you could have 3 hours on this, just analysis and forecasting, but I want to be cautious of the time that we have here. So I'll go through very basic analysis stuff here, and then towards the end, some of the stuff around earnings quality and red flags, if you will. And as you'll see, there'll be times where there'll be sort of a mishmash because some red flags may actually come up while we're doing this discussion here as well. So with that, I want to walk you through, like go back to the very basics. And so to the extent that we're talking to like retail investors, देखें जब भी हम बात करते हैं एक बिजनेस की, किसी भी बिजनेस को रन करने के लिए assets चाहिए होते हैं. I mean, that's the reality of things, right? If you want to get something done, want to get a business started, it needs some types of assets. And broadly speaking, we have two types: they're current and fixed. What's the idea? There are some assets in which we are investing for the short term, which are our current assets. Other assets are long term, so those are mostly long term or fixed assets. At the end of the day, what makes asset an asset is its ability to generate cash. So short-term assets are going to generate cash in the short term. Fixed assets are going to do that in the long term. But at the end of the day, both these require some cash outlay up front. I think that's the key part, and that's the nature of any business, right? So within current assets, you'll have cash equivalents, accounts receivable, inventory. Again, inventory is a classic example because again, you're putting money in, and then you're hoping to generate sales and then cash. Fixed assets, these are your long-term assets, so net property, plant, and equipment. So this is the asset side of things, very, very, very sort of casually speaking. Why is this important? If we're saying there's a business which requires assets, assets don't come out of thin air. Assets need to be funded from somewhere, right? Something has to give. And so where does the funding come from? That's captured on the right-hand side of the balance sheet, right? So again, funding can come from two main sources. It can either come in the form of debt. So you can have short-term debt or long-term debt. So short-term debt is current liabilities, long-term debt as well, long-term debt. So So within current liabilities, you'll have something like accounts payable. आपका supplier है, आपने उससे पैसे borrow किए हुए, आपने borrow किए हुए. Accounts payable is a form of borrowing. People don't really think of that as borrowing. कहते हैं यार मैं तो इस पे interest rate pay नहीं कर रहा. लेकिन to the extent that you have a liability, this means that you have to have this outlay later on. So you are borrowing in that sense. So accounts payable is a borrowing. Notes payable is more formal, but it's both short term. You have long term, which is more long term borrowing. और फिर जो आप डेट से फाइनेंस नहीं कर पाते वो फिर आपकी इक्विटी की फॉर्म में आता. So that shareholders equity, and again, very broadly speaking, this is consistent of two things. One, you have your initial equity that you've put in, but then over time, as the business is running, you put in more money, so that's accumulated retained earnings. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think the main point that I'm trying to make over here is that the balance sheet balances because it kind of has to, right? On the left-hand side, you have all the places where cash went. And on the right-hand side, you need to know where that money came from. That's really what the balance sheet is capturing. The reason why this is important because आपके यहाँ पे जो सारे जो assets होते हैं, इनमें से काफी सारे, especially all of these, accounts receivable, inventory, net property, plant and equipment, these are your operating assets. Cash and cash equivalents के अंदर भी कुछ हो सकते हैं operating, लेकिन sometimes a lot of it is excess cash. And if it's excess cash, which means that it's lying around in marketable securities or it's lying around in deposit, then it's really not helping with operations. So इनमें से जो assets जो operations के अंदर help कर रहे होते हैं, that is actually what feeds into your income statement. Right? So this is the thing that is making your income statement sort of move. So वहाँ पे फिर जैसे आपके inventory और ये fixed assets जो हैं, ये sales create कर रहे हैं, आपकी cost of goods sold होंगी, जिसके अंदर आपने of course जैसे purchases की, selling general administrative expenses आ जाएंगे. Depreciation जो है वो इस special किस्म का operating expense है because it's a non-cash expense. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail here, again because we're sort of constrained on time. But the main point is this: people don't think about it usually, but the income statement itself is broken down into two sections. There's this operating section where all of the costs that you're seeing here are operating costs, right? These are costs due to operations. But then there is this interest expense. And what is interesting about interest expense is that it's a financing expense. It is an expense, but it did not result because of your operations. That's the key. It resulted because how you chose to finance your operations. Look, ये operations का कसूर नहीं है कि आपने debt लिया जाके, लेकिन अगर आपकी situation ऐसी थी कि you had to get debt to fund your assets, well, that's not the asset's fault per se. This is important because sometimes people will calculate something like return on assets, right? It's a common profitability measure. And they'll use something like, like net income over assets. It's very common. You'll see this in a lot of textbooks even. And technically, this is not correct. And the reason for that is simple. You are using something like net income, which is net of all expenses, including interest expense, but you are essentially blaming the assets for an expense that it's not their fault really. So usually you don't want to use this in the numerator. You want to have something like EBIT or something like EBITDA, which is more of, it's an earnings measure, which is more reflective of, well, what is happening through the operation of the assets. So again, jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but again, wanted to give you this idea that income statement itself has an operating section and a sort of a financing section, if you will. So then you have your taxes and everything. Again, you can have a bunch of other stuff here, and then that's this figure, net income, right? We love this guy. You open up a balance sheet or you open up financial statements, and the first thing you do is what's the net income like? What's the earnings per share like? Analysts love it. These are what forecasts are made on predominantly. And then you have the addition to retained earnings, which then feeds into your equity side on the balance sheet as well. Okay, so I wanted to do this roundup because, look, at the end of the day, any business is the dance of really these figures, right? It's if you can understand this dance, that you can understand how the business is working. Now, net income, it like I said, it gets a lot of attention. But here's two fundamental problems if you're focusing on net income, and this is what I was driving towards. The first thing is that higher net income is not higher cash flow. People don't realize this. हमारा हमारा ये होता है कि हम जब बिजनेस रन कर रहे होते हैं हम कहते हैं अच्छा पैसे कितने बने, एंड वी ऑटोमेटिकली एसोसिएट नेट इनकम विद पैसे कितने बने. नेट इनकम नेसेसरली पैसे नहीं है. ये एक बड़ा फंडामेंटल फ्लॉ है बहुत से रिटेल इन्वेस्टर्स की थिंकिंग में कि कहते हैं बस प्रॉफिट बन गया इसका मतलब पैसे बन गए. नहीं, जरूरी नहीं है. मैं आपको 2 एग्जांपल्स देता हूं. एक तो ये कि what if all of your sales or most of your sales and receivables, if you go back to the income statement, right, you see a lot of sales over here. Now, some of you who are more familiar with the accounting process, they'll know that there's something called accrual accounting. Accrual accounting ये कहती है कि एक दफा आपने डिलीवरी कर दी या शिपमेंट भेज दी या एक सेल sort of recognize होगी तो you don't necessarily have to receive cash for it. आपका कस्टमर आपको बोलता है ठीक है जी डिलीवरी होगी मैं आपको पैसे बाद में दे दूंगा. Technically you have a sale, but it's all getting reflected in a higher account receivable balance. So you could have a very high net income and yet have no cash to show for it because you have a very high receivables balance, right? So you're profitable, not high cash flow. The other thing is the depreciation. Depreciation is a non-cash expense. So जब आप depreciation को subtract कर रहे होते हैं यहाँ पे, तो technically आप एक कोई cash outlay नहीं होता. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail as to how that happens, but long story short, depreciation is not an actual cash outlay. Cash outlay उस वक्त होता है जब आप कोई मशीनरी खरीदते हैं, उस वक्त हो गया. Depreciation is just your way of sort of accounting में एक matching principle होता है. So you're just trying to match the use of that asset over time is what it is. By the way, I'm seeing some questions pop up. If you don't mind, I'll take them towards the end and I'll let the moderator sort of decide which questions we can answer. The other very very important thing, आपने ये तो देख लिया कि operation side के ऊपर हम net income is not necessarily cash flow, but the other major problem with focusing on net income कि आप सिर्फ एक business की running के ऊपर ध्यान दे रहे हैं, operations के ऊपर mostly ध्यान दे रहे हैं, right? Sales कितनी हुई, cost कितनी हुई, क्या हुआ, लेकिन what about all that money that is getting spent on investments, right? अगर आप एक बिजनेस रन कर रहे हैं उसमें से कुछ पैसा अगर बनता भी है, अगर उससे नेसेसरली आप टू री इन्वेस्ट करना है क्योंकि आप ग्रो कर रहे हैं, तो फिर आपके पास पैसे नहीं है, राइट? यू आर प्रॉफिटेबल, योर ऑपरेशंस आर प्रॉफिटेबल, but you're still bleeding cash, right? And that part is not reflected just by net income. And for that very reason, perhaps the stuff that you should look at is something like the statement of cash flows. Now, the statement of cash flows, again, due to the shortage of time, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the statement of cash flows does exactly this. It says, let's focus on cash flows. Let's not focus on profitability. Let's focus on cash flows. Cash flows, we can categorize them into 3 broad categories. So cash flow from operating activities. Notice how this is structured. It will start with net income. because देखिए प्रॉफिट से स्टार्ट करते हैं, लेकिन भैया एक बात, वो जो डिप्रिसिएशन आपने निकाली थी ना, टेक्निकली वो कैश गया नहीं था क्योंकि वो तो एक नॉन कैश एक्सपेंस था, उसको वापस ऐड करते हैं. फिर इसी तरह से अगर ये नेट इनकम हाई थी क्योंकि आपके पास ज्यादातर जो सेल्स थी वो रिसीवेबल्स में थी, तो आपको तो पैसे मिले ही नहीं, तो सब्ट्रैक्ट कर दें एनी इंक्रीज इन अकाउंट रिसीवेबल. जितने से आपका अकाउंट रिसीवेबल ऊपर गया उसी से नेट इनकम ये कैश फ्लो को डिफ्लेट कर दें, बिकॉज ये कैश अभी तक आया नहीं है, ये फंसा हुआ है, राइट? सो अगेन द मेन पॉइंट इज कि ये आपको एक आइडिया देता है कि आपके ऑपरेशन से कैश फ्लो कितना बन रहा है. लेकिन फिर वो इट डजंट स्टॉप देयर, वो कहता है हाँ अब ऑपरेशंस की बात तो हो गई, लेकिन इन्वेस्टिंग एक्टिविटीज, आप अगर कैपिटल एक्सपेंडिचर्स बहुत कर रहे हैं तो, या आप प्रॉपर्टी बेच रहे हैं तो यहाँ पे आपका रिफ्लेक्ट होना चाहिए. कैश फ्लो फ्रॉम फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटीज ये बताते हैं कि अच्छा पैसे जो हैं वो आए कहाँ से. अगर आपने डेट इशू किया, मतलब ये सारी जो एक्टिविटी हो रही है पैसे कहीं से आने भी तो है ना. अब अगर आपने इक्विटी रेज की तो उससे पैसे आएंगे, वो फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटी. ये बड़ा जरूरी पॉइंट है कि फाइनेंसिंग को हम हमेशा सेपरेट रखते हैं. अच्छा, तो there is this very important term that you should be familiar with. It's called free cash flow. Free cash flow. So ये जो operating activities और investing activities हैं, approximately this translates into free cash flow. कहने free, ये तो बड़ी जबरदस्त बात है. free कहाँ पे? देखिए free इस तरह से नहीं कि बस जाएं और ले लें, उस तरह से नहीं कि sale वाला. This is more, it's free to be distributed to capital providers. मतलब आपके जो बिजनेस के अंदर जो एसेट्स हैं जो कि फंक्शनल हैं, उनसे क्या कैश फ्लो, उन एसेट से ओवरऑल नेट ऑफ इन्वेस्टिंग एक्टिविटीज आपका क्या कैश फ्लो कितना जनरेट हो रहा है, राइट? people often use this term free cash flow from assets. जब भी हम from का इस्तेमाल करते हैं लफ्ज़ तो ऐसा लगता है जैसे cash flow positive है. नहीं, actually free cash flow for a lot of companies tends to be actually a negative as well. So I'll give you some examples, but the key insight is this, and this is very, very important. If you're a novice retail investor, this is what you must understand, that a highly profitable business with high net income consistently growing can have low and often negative cash flow. And this is especially true of young firms. Young firms से क्या है, start हुई हैं, profitable है. मेरा एक दोस्त था, बड़ा जबरदस्त business कर रहे थे वो, great margins, like 150, 200 plus margins. लेकिन होता क्या था, he was always feeling the need to reinvest back into investments. तो आपके पास कभी cash है नहीं, आप profitable हैं, लेकिन आपके पास cash ही नहीं. So young firms which are growing, और देखें, negative cash flow मैं ये नहीं कहना चाह रहा कि this is necessarily a bad thing, but you need to know कि अगर आज cash flow negative है तो future में cash flow positive कब होगा भाई? Because अगर आपको future में नजर नहीं होता हुआ नजर आ रहा, then it's a problem, right? So this saying over here, the revenue is vanity, earning is sanity, but the cash is reality. That's the जब आप एक कंपनी के आप जब स्टॉक खरीद रहे हैं, आप ये थोड़ी कह रहे हैं कि हाँ यार मैं लूंगा, 3 महीने बाद आके पैसे ले लेना. नहीं, आप पैसे अभी दें. What you care about is when are you going to get the money, right? And that's why you care about the cash flow. I want to give you an example.
Sorry, मैं एक चीज इसमें ऐड कर दूं. I think it's a very important point which you have raised. क्योंकि पाकिस्तानी कॉन्टेक्स्ट में जहां पर हमारी कंपनीज में सर्कुलर डेट है पावर सेक्टर में, और अकाउंट रिसीवेबल जो आपने हाईलाइट किया है, ये बड़ा एक इम्पोर्टेंट फैक्टर है. काफी पाकिस्तानी कंपनीज में पैसे पाकिस्तान में फंस जाते हैं. और so thank you for highlighting that, and I just wanted to give that to point that in the case of Pakistan, I think it's very important for investors to focus on this because काफी बड़ा गैप हो सकता है.
नहीं, बिल्कुल बिल्कुल अली, in fact I'm glad you mentioned it. बल्कि मैं जिस दोस्त की बात कर रहा था, he was also in Pakistan, and जो वो एक ऑनलाइन बिजनेस कर रहे थे, और उसके अंदर because वहां पे at least at that time recognizing this credit card payments wasn't as broadly accepted, so this was cash on delivery business. ठीक है, अब आप देखें ना उसके अंदर कितना बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है कि आप देखें, आप अगर 1000 की चीज ले रहे हैं, आप उसे 5000 में भी बेच रहे हैं, लेकिन अगर उस प्रोसेस के अंदर आपके मार्जिन बहुत अच्छे हैं, लेकिन आपका 1000 अगर 3 महीने तक फंसा हुआ है, ठीक है, बिकॉज आपका जो कस्टमर है उसने पैसे ही आपको उस वक्त देने हैं जब कैश ऑन डिलीवरी मॉडल है, तो आप प्रॉफिटेबल हो लेकिन आपके पास कभी कैश नहीं. सो आई थिंक दिस फीड्स इनटू व्हाट यू आर सेइंग, that ultimately cash is very, very important, and I'll highlight some of the things that you can do to assess this thing in just a minute. But I wanted to Netflix के बारे में सबने सुना हुआ होगा, I'm presuming COVID के अंदर तो और भी ज्यादा. So Netflix, देखिए, Netflix revenue great growth, and Netflix comes out all the time saying हमारी सब्सक्राइबर ग्रोथ जो है वो बढ़ रही है, और उसके ऊपर, और नेट इनकम देखिए, नेट इनकम उनकी पॉजिटिव है. लेकिन अगर आप देखेंगे नेटफ्लिक्स का फ्री कैश फ्लो, इट हैज बीन कंसिस्टेंटली नेगेटिव, एंड द रीजन इज वेरी सिंपल. नेटफ्लिक्स को अपना मॉडल रन करने के लिए दे हैव टू कंटिन्यू टू री इन्वेस्ट द मनी इन कंटेंट क्रिएशन. आप नेटफ्लिक्स पे इसलिए होते हैं क्योंकि आपकी नई मूवी या कोई नए शोज या कोई नया कंटेंट आता रहता है, राइट? And so my personal belief is that Netflix will like I have sort of a question mark as to when this will become positive and sustainable, because this model requires Netflix to continually reinvest in content, which means that capex काफी ज़्यादा होगा. So when like foreseeable future, when do you see financial cash flow becoming positive? It's not ultimately clear. Uber is the same problem. We'll come to that. So अच्छा, उसमें होता ये कि अब अगर आप, and especially, and this I've seen with a lot of young firms also, if you are profitable and you are retaining back, but you are, in order to retain back, you have to reinvest in your assets to grow. Sometimes वो जो internal funding होती है through your operations, that's not enough. So what do? You borrow, or you go to external markets. आप equity raise करते हैं, आप debt raise करते हैं. Netflix के केस में देखिए कि Netflix का over time debt has been on the rise. And this is, again, it can be a source of concern is what I'm trying to say, because, and this is, I've seen this one too many times for young firms. They get excited. They see a lot of growth. Orders are coming in. they're like, let's go get more debt, and eventually us cash flow shortage ki wajah se they become overly indebted, and then they run into financial distress, right? And so it is very, 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 very important to focus on cash flow. आपको जहन से earnings निकाल के थोड़ा cash flow पे सोचना पड़ेगा to support. So red flag basically ये है, it's just based on this. Be very wary of investing in businesses pursuing relentless growth. They're bleeding cash in the process, increasing debt at the same time because they're bleeding cash and they have to fund it from somewhere, and there is no clear path to becoming positive cash flow, right? Companies will come out with a lot of stories, and in some cases they're warranted. Like ठीक है, Facebook ने WhatsApp 19 billion का acquire कर लिया और उस वक्त लोग ये कह रहे थे भैया किस चीज के लिए, WhatsApp तो free है, लेकिन उसके अंदर आप कह रहे हैं ठीक है हमें subscriber मिल रहा है, and there is something called a real option, we can monetize it. So Facebook को already एक setup था, and it was somewhat clearer कि वो उस extra $1 billion की जो user base acquire कर रहे हैं in emerging markets, उसको somehow किस तरह से monetize कर लेंगे, या at least उसको एक Facebook के ecosystem के अंदर रख के उसको further monetize कर लेंगे. Maybe not necessarily through WhatsApp, but maybe through Facebook itself. लेकिन अब for companies like Uber, it's not that clear, right? In fact, lately Uber ने अपनी जो trajectory वो sort of change इसीलिए की है कि कहने चले अब हम electric vehicles के अंदर आ जाते हैं जी, क्योंकि maybe वो ज़्यादा solid business है. तो क्योंकि उनका जो existing business है ride sharing का, that's bleeding cash like nobody's business, right? So anyway, so this is the basic rundown on financial statements. Key point here being focus on the cash flow. अच्छा, फिर analysis की बात आती है. तो देखिए अगर आप एक retail investor हैं और अगर आप analyze कर रहे हैं तो बहुत simple questions हैं. मतलब for example, is the business able to meet its short-term obligations? हमने जब balance sheet की बात की थी तो हमने कहा था कि देखिए राइट साइड पे सोर्सेज ऑफ फंडिंग है, मतलब ये वो लोग हैं जिन्होंने आपको, जैसे डेट है, डेट शॉर्ट टर्म है, लॉन्ग टर्म है, ये लोग स्पेशली वो हैं जो जिन्होंने आपको पैसा दिया और शॉर्ट टर्म में पेमेंट वापस एक्सपेक्ट कर रहे हैं. जैसे आपके सप्लायर्स, नोट्स पेएबल हो गए, समटाइम्स करंट पोर्शन ऑफ लॉन्ग टर्म डेट का मतलब है कि अभी आपने उधार लिया था 10 ईयर लोन एंड नाउ देयर इज वन दिस ईयर्स पेमेंट कमिंग अप. बॉटम लाइन इज कि कंपनी ने कैश आउटले करना है. अब प्रॉब्लम क्या है कि अगर आपका बहुत सारा पैसा यहाँ पे है तो these by definition are long term investments. यहाँ से आपको पैसा इतना नहीं आना to meet these. So it better be the case that you have enough money in this stuff which can cover this stuff, right? It better be the case that in the short term you're going to be receiving some cash which can be met, which you can get to meet your short term obligations. So you have stuff like current ratio, right? Current ratio कहता है, take a look at current assets divided by current liabilities. And again, most people, I'm presuming a lot of you are familiar with this, but most people will sort of calculate this and see, oh, this number is greater than 1, great. It's greater than 1, this means I'm making more in short term than I am getting in liabilities. Okay, let's move on. Be careful. While greater than 1 is good, at least it's comforting, you don't want to be too liquid. You don't want this number to be extraordinarily high, like 3 or something. And again, problem with ratios is that there is no real benchmark. Like you can't really say 3 is good or 1 is good. It really depends on the business. My point is that you don't want to be too liquid. And the reason for that is simple. Aapke current assets jo hain, they're not that profitable. You can be very liquid by holding everything in cash. आपके पास सारा कुछ कैश में पड़ा हुआ है, आप बहुत लिक्विड हैं, कोई भी आएगा आपके पास पैसे लेने के लिए आप फौरन दे देंगे, नो प्रॉब्लम. लेकिन प्रॉब्लम ये है कि these are not very profitable. आपका main money maker जो है वो यहाँ पे होता है in your long term investments. So इसीलिए आप देखेंगे कि if a business becomes too liquid, they become susceptible to takeovers. यहाँ पे outside investors कहेंगे management को भाई तुम निकलो, I think we can make better use of these assets, because जैसे Apple की आप example लें, Apple has been the target of many activist investors क्योंकि वो billions of dollars पे बैठे हुए हैं और वो एक्टिविस्ट इन्वेस्टर्स आते हैं, वो कहते हैं कि भाई रीपर्चेस द शेयर्स, भाई ये पैसा क्यों लेके बैठे हो, शेयर होल्डर्स को वापस करो अगर तुमने इसके साथ कुछ करना नहीं. सो एनीवे, बॉटम लाइन इज के रेशियोज के साथ यू हैव टू बी केयरफुल. इट्स अ बैलेंसिंग एक्ट. फिर इज द बिजनेस एबल टू मीट इट लॉन्ग टर्म ऑब्लिगेशंस. ये आपका लॉन्ग टर्म डेट है, क्या आप इसको मीट कर सकते हैं? अब इसके अंदर भी पीपल कैलकुलेट लॉट्स ऑफ रेशियोज. डेट रेशियो है जी कि ये लॉन्ग टर्म या टोटल डेट लें उसको डिवाइडेड बाय एसेट्स कर लें, या डेट टू इक्विटी रेशियो. दिस इज फाइन. again, be kind of wary, because there's a very fundamental problem with the balance sheet, which is that it records everything at book value or accounting value. This is kind of important because सब कुछ historical cost पे. So हो सकता है कि आपके पास let's suppose $50,000 का loan हो और आपके assets जो हैं total यहाँ पे वो 100,000 worth हो on the books. You are 50% in debt. You're like, oh man, this is too high. लेकिन देखिए 100,000 जो आप book value of assets दे रहे हैं, this is on books. ठीक है, it's very possible कि market के अंदर इन assets की worth बहुत ज्यादा है, right? जैसे आप घर लेते हैं, आपने घर तो ले लिया 1 million का, ठीक है, आपने debt भी ले लिया उसके ऊपर, अब घर की value अगर बढ़ गई तो then you're not that indebted, right? Because आपको पता है कि आप घर बेच के कभी भी पैसा ले सकते हैं. So be careful. बैलेंस शीट के अंदर आपको अकाउंटिंग वैल्यू नजर आ रही होती है चीजों की, लेकिन मार्केट वैल्यू नहीं नजर आ रही होती है. So these ratios, you have to accept them with a grain of salt. Acha, this is very, very important. I want to emphasize this because especially if some of you out there who are starting their own businesses, I think this, in my experience, this is the most understated set of ratios and yet the most important ones. How efficiently is the business managing its assets and its liabilities? तो उसके अंदर देखें, like how efficient are your assets? क्या मतलब? अगर फॉर एग्जाम्पल अगर आपके पास इन्वेंटोरी, हम कब कह सकते हैं कि हमारी इन्वेंटोरी एफिशिएंट है? तो फाइनेंशियल स्टेटमेंट एनालिसिस के अंदर उसकी मायने ये रखता है कि अगर आपकी इन्वेंटोरी आ रही है और आप उसको फौरन देखें, इन्वेंटोरी जो है वो बैलेंस शीट में ऊपर जाती है, फिर आप सेल करते हैं, जैसी सेल करते हैं इन्वेंटोरी आ जाती है नीचे, बिकॉज आपकी सेल होगी, फिर आप वापस सप्लायर के पास जाते हैं, इन्वेंटोरी फिर ऊपर जाती है, सेल्स अक्यूमुलेटेड और ऊपर बढ़ती हैं, इन्वेंटोरी फिर नीचे गई. तो ये इन्वेंटोरी ऊपर नीचे ऊपर नीचे ऊपर नीचे हो रही है, राइट, बार बार, और उसकी वजह से सेल्स बढ़ती जा रही है. आपकी इन्वेंटोरी आप कहेंगे उस वक्त एफिशिएंट है जब आप उसको टर्नओवर या बहुत फ्रीक्वेंटली उसको ऊपर नीचे कर रहे हैं साल में, so that the inventory is not really lying around in your warehouse too long. It comes in, goes out, comes in, goes out. Walmart is known for this, right? Walmart की, this is important because अगर आपकी inventory efficient है, then you can afford to have relatively lower margins, right? Because आपका volume का game बन जाता है. So days sales in inventory capture करता है कि आपकी inventory कितनी देर lie around कर रही है. And again, देखिए जितनी देर आपकी इन्वेंटोरी लाई अराउंड कर रही है, इसका मतलब है कि उतनी ही देर आपका पैसा फंसा हुआ है बेसिकली, राइट? और ये भी नहीं है कि आप बेच देंगे तो पैसा मिल जाएगा, नहीं, क्योंकि जब आप बेचेंगे तो आपका कस्टमर कहेगा भैया शुक्रिया, अब 30 दिन बाद आना, मैं पैसे उस वक्त दे दूंगा. सो देन डे सेल्स इन रिसीवेबल्स इज अनदर. सो दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट कि आपकी इन्वेंटोरी कितनी देर लाई अराउंड कर रही है, आपके रिसीवेबल्स कितनी देर लाई अराउंड कर रहे हैं. So there's a name for this. This, when you add up day sales and inventory and receivables, this is known as a firm's operating cycle. So to give you an example, अगर inventory 20 दिन के लिए आप रखते हैं warehouse में और फिर मजीद 30 दिन लगते हैं आपको उसको बेच के उस पे पैसा collect करने में, this means that for 50 days you are waiting on cash. अच्छा, तो आप कहते हैं 50 दिन के लिए मेरा पैसा तो फंसा हुआ है. Well, kind of, because what if you had gone to, this is very important. What if you had gone to your suppliers and told them, भैया मुझे ये सारी इन्वेंटोरी दो ताकि मैं प्रोसेसेस स्टार्ट करूं, मैं भी तुम्हें पैसे दूंगा 40 दिन के बाद. So days your purchases are in payables. Let's suppose that you yourself are going to pay back your suppliers in 40 days. Then it's not all bad news, because then technically आपका अपना पैसा जो फंसा हुआ है, राइट, वो 50 दिन के लिए नहीं फंसा हुआ, आपने खुद 40 दिन के बाद पेमेंट की है, तो आपका पैसा टेक्निकली सिर्फ 10 दिन के लिए फंसा हुआ है, राइट? सो फाइनेंस के अंदर इसको हम बोलते हैं व्हाट इज योर कैश साइकिल, व्हाट इज योर कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल. कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल इज नथिंग बट operating cycle, which is the sum of these two numbers, and you net out the days purchases and payables. This is the key point. You want to have a business with a low cash conversion cycle. आपका मकसद ये है कि you want to have this as low as possible. You can do this in two ways. या तो आप अपना ऑपरेटिंग साइकिल कम कर सकते हैं कि आपके रिसीवेबल्स में पैसे नहीं फंसे हुए हो ज्यादा देर, आपके इन्वेंटोरी में पैसे ज्यादा देर नहीं फंसे हुए हो, या आप अपनी पेमेंट्स, इफ यू कैन, पेमेंट्स अपने सप्लायर को डिले कर सकते हैं, राइट? क्योंकि डेज परचेज इन पेबल्स जितना ज्यादा होगा उसका मतलब है आपका अपना पैसा उतना कम लग रहा है और उतना आप अपने सप्लायर के पैसे से पैसा बना रहे हैं। मैं आपको एक एग्जांपल देता हूं। और बाय द वे यहां पे रेड फ्लैग ये हो गया कि अगर आप एक बिजनेस को देख रहे हैं जिसका कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल ओवर टाइम लेंथन हो रहा है, कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल बढ़ रहा है, दैट इज अ प्रॉब्लम, राइट? बिकॉज हमने बात की थी ना कैश फ्लो की। इसका मतलब यह है कि आपका पैसा ज्यादा देर के लिए फंस रहा है, राइट? ये काफी होता है। मैं आपको बताऊं कि जैसे आप कह रहे हैं यार बिजनेस ग्रो नहीं कर रहा, मुझे ग्रोथ दिखानी है। आप कस्टमर के पास गए, आपने कहा यार मेरे से ये ऑर्डर ले लो। कस्टमर, आपका कस्टमर कहता है यार मैं ले तो लूं लेकिन मेरे पास, मैं खुद अपना बिजनेस रन कर रहा हूं, मैं तुम्हें कैसे पैसे दूंगा? मैं तो 30 दिन में, तो मुझे पता है तुम पैसे मांगते हो। आप उसे क्या बोलते हैं? कहते हैं यार मुझे अपनी भी ग्रोथ दिखानी है, तो एक काम कर, तू मुझे 50 दिन बाद यार पैसे दे देना। कहते हैं अच्छा चलो ठीक है। वो इनवॉइस लिख देगा, आपकी सेल हो गई, इनकम स्टेटमेंट में सेल्स आ गया, नेट इनकम ज्यादा हो गई। लेकिन क्या हो रहा है? ये आपने एक एक्स्ट्रा स्पेशल डिस्काउंट्स दिए टू शो हायर रेवेन्यू ग्रोथ, हायर अर्निंग्स ग्रोथ। आपका कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल लेकिन ओवर टाइम लेंथन हो रहा है। अगर आप कैश फ्लो स्टेटमेंट पे फोकस रखते और इनकम पे नहीं रखते तो आप पकड़ लेते, राइट? सो अगेन कैश कन्वर्जन साइकिल बड़ी जरूरी चीज है। मैं आपको बताता हूं Amazon के बारे में, अगेन डिटेल में नहीं जाऊंगा, लेकिन Amazon को रफली 35 से 40 दिन लगते हैं उसकी इन्वेंटोरी को कन्वर्ट करने में। रिसीवेबल्स के अंदर उनका पैसा बहुत थोड़ी देर होता है। सो दिस इज देयर ऑपरेटिंग साइकिल। आप देखें कि हाउ लॉन्ग इट टेक्स फॉर Amazon टू पे बैक इट्स सप्लायर्स, ऑलमोस्ट 3 months। यानी कि अगर आप एक सेलर हैं Amazon पे और आपने सेल कर दी, Amazon कहता है भैया सेल तो हो गई लेकिन जो पैसे इससे मिल रहे हैं ना तुम्हें, वो मैं तुम्हें 90 दिन बाद दूंगा। तो और उस सारे पैसे से Amazon खुद पैसा बना रहा है। Amazon has a negative cash conversion cycle. Negative. It's not low, it's negative. Apple is the same. आप आईफोन, नया आईफोन आ रहा है, आप क्या करते हैं? भाई ऑर्डर कर दो, भाई प्री ऑर्डर, आई एम एप्पल फोन लॉयल, ठीक है? आपने प्री ऑर्डर कर, प्री ऑर्डर में क्या है? आर देयर एनी रिसीवेबल्स? नो। आप हेडक्वार्टर सो टू स्पीक फोन करें कि भाई ये लो मेरे पैसे, जब बन जाए तो भेज देना। और Amazon क्या करता है? रिसीवेबल्स में जीरो मनी, Amazon के रिसीवेबल जीरो, वो तो पैसा आप फ्रंट दे रहे। और फिर Amazon क्या करेगा? Amazon लगाएगा फोन चाइना, हेलो चाइना प्लीज फोन बना के मेरे पास नहीं भेजना भैया, सीधा भेज देना पाकिस्तान, मुझे इन्वेंटोरी नहीं चाहिए। Amazon की इन्वेंटोरी जीरो। और फिर चाइना कहेगा सेट, वो तो मैं कर दूंगा, पैसे बाद में आना। Amazon, so days purchases in payables is very long. So Amazon has consistently had, I'm sorry, Apple, consistently negative cash conversion cycle. That's a beautiful thing. मैं आपको एक academic research paper cite करूंगा. This is for some of you who are sort of investing के point of view से अगर आप देख रहे हैं, अगर आप portfolios, this is slightly advanced, maybe for some of you who are more sort of into like alpha, if you will. There's a recent paper which says that there's a trading strategy that you can develop. If you take 100 firms and sort them into portfolios so that the top 10 are those which have the lowest cash conversion cycle, and then you go to the next 10 and the next 10 so that the highest 10 are those with the highest cash conversion cycle, and then if you track their market performance over time, right, and you try to explain their market performance through something like the capital asset pricing model or beta, they're different pricing models. Again, I don't want to go into too much. Main point uska ye tha ji ki agar aap ye karte hain, those with the lower cash conversion cycle tend to outperform those with a high cash conversion cycle. This is after accounting for other factors that can explain returns, like beta, for example. Okay? So I don't know if some of you who are more, inclined to pursue a strategy or at least find out how this happens in the context of Pakistan, welcome to try it. All right, but so here's a good idea. All right. What other financial analysis? Profitability of the businesses. Of course, our business में invest कर रहे हैं. How profitable is the business? That's again, you want to know different ways to do this. उसके अंदर profit margins, आप gross net calculate कर सकते हैं. Return on equity is an important one. Return on assets की मैं आपसे बात कर रहा था, उसके अंदर again you want to be careful. Please don't do net income over assets. It does tell you something. It's not, in my opinion, this is not really telling you though what you're actually wanting it to tell you, which is return on assets. Technically, this should be a number which is not influenced by financing, because it's not the asset's fault that you funded your assets with debt. So use something like EBIT or EBITDA. A more common metric that is used is return on invested capital. And again, don't want to go into too much detail, but it's a close cousin to return on assets, because what it says is that, look, within assets, you can, for example, have a lot of excess cash. Ab wo agar excess cash aapka pada hua hai, then technically it's not invested anywhere. And if it's not invested in operations, then technically, jab aap return on assets measure kar rahe hain, you shouldn't really account for this. So take your total assets, but then net of any excess cash, because that's, well, it's not invested really. So again, a couple of other nuances to this, but return on invested capital is very important. And again, you want to be wary of investing in firms whose return on assets or return on invested capital is less than the cost of capital. Cost of capital requires a whole different discussion, but basically, jab aap debt or equity raise kar rahe hote hain to fund all of these assets, debt holders want a certain rate of, they're expecting a certain rate of return on their investment, and equity holders are expecting a certain rate of return. And so that is the cost of, so that is the cost of debt, that is the cost of equity. And so the cost of capital really is what your capital providers are expecting from you as the manager, from all the investments that you're making. And if the return on invested capital is coming out to be less than the cost of capital, that means that on average, you are not making value increasing decisions. So, and the business therefore is not making value increasing decisions. So we can have a whole different discussion on this, but I wanted to give you a interesting sort of graph over here. This was, it's been done multiple times with McKinsey as well. It's plotting the return on invested, the difference between return on invested capital and weighted average cost of capital. So how much that difference is, and plotting that against how valuable the businesses are, which a measure of that is something called the enterprise value. Again, I'm sorry if I'm throwing some financial jargon out there, but main point ye hai ki how much are you, let's try to see the relationship between the two, and there is a very strong positive relationship. So those firms or those businesses which are generating a high rate of return on their invested capital compared to their cost, those are the ones that over time tend to be more and more valuable. I'm sorry, Ali, I don't know if you've left, and whoever the moderator is, please, if you can keep me honest to the time. I feel like I'm going okay now, but please feel free to stop me. Okay, so then there's some things to watch out for. So Ali ne mujhe kaha ki red flags. Now, you know, like, so I'll point out certain things. The things is that sometimes even auditors miss out on a lot of things. So I'll give you some pointers, but you will probably need a full-blown sort of course in forensic accounting to really get it, because this stuff gets really deep. So I don't want to go into too much depth. मैंने कुछ sort of small points तो आपको बता ही दिए. But before we even go there, like एक concern होती है ना कि what if managers are manipulate कर रहे हैं earnings को, तो मैं कैसे बचूं? I think fundamentally first you need to understand why do firms manage or manipulate earnings. आप पहले उनका मकसद तो समझ जाएं. I think अगर आप वो मकसद समझेंगे तो आपको थोड़ी बेहतर understanding होगी कि what I should be looking for them. So very quick rundown on why do firms even try to manage or manipulate earnings. और उसके अंदर काफी सारी चीजें हैं. I think analyst and investor expectations is a big one. हमारे analysts tend to focus so much on earnings per share, और even यहाँ पे भी earnings per share की forecast आती है analyst से, और अगर आप उसको miss कर दें, so there are huge repercussions, because आपका stock price नीचे जा सकती है, और अगर आपकी stock price नीचे चली गई, this can have an impact on whether you can get additional funding from other equity investors or other banks for that matter, because वो कहेंगे आपकी market value of assets थोड़ी सी low है. So there's a lot of pressure on meeting analysts, sometimes investor expectations, right? And similarly, अगर वो नहीं हो, so then at least in the US, there is a big portion there's a big portion of the executive compensation which is tied to how the market, how the stock is going to perform. This is a big debate. Back in early 2000 there was this option backdating scandal और काफी तरह के scandals इस तरह के थे जिसके अंदर basically in order to get a higher stock price so that you can make a lot of money on your executive compensation, you're trying to manipulate earnings, trying to beat analyst forecasts so that, well, you can get richer. So there's that. And this is important. Some firms like to show smooth earnings trajectory. Who wants to show 25% growth in one year, -5 in the other? People don't like that. Nobody would. तो उसके अंदर क्या करती हैं फिर companies? They try to manipulate the earnings upwards in bad times, but the important thing is that there is also an incentive, therefore, to manipulate it downwards during the good times. So there's something called like cookie jar reserves. कि company कहती है यार ये तो quarter बड़ा जबरदस्त किया था, एक काम करते हैं ये reserve balance बढ़ाते हैं अपना, ठीक है, बोलते हैं कि हमने जी inventory का reserve जो है ना वो या bad debts का reserve जो है वो ज्यादा हो गया, लेकिन उसको ना side पे करके रख देंगे, अगला quarter अगर बुरा गया ना तो यहाँ से fill कर देंगे gap, right? So that the earnings trajectory is smoother. So that's why firms sort of manage or manipulate earnings. So these are the incentives, broadly speaking, incentives. Incentives अपनी जगह हैं, लेकिन अगर आपके पास incentive हो लेकिन opportunity नहीं हो तो फिर आप कैसे करेंगे? वो है ना पाकिस्तान में पाकिस्तान के अंसारी वो कहते हैं कि जो शरीफ वो है जिसको मौका नहीं मिला, तो वो यही है ना कि incentive तो सबके पास है इस तरह का, लेकिन मौके की भी बात है. अब मौका कब मिलता है? जनरली मौका उस वक्त मिलता है जब आपकी गवर्नेंस वीक है, जब आपके बोर्ड ऑफ डायरेक्टर्स जो हैं they are not doing a good job of monitoring. So for example, इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर्स की हम बात करते हैं, ओ जी इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर है. अब इंडिपेंडेंट डायरेक्टर जिस तरह से डिफाइन होता है वो बोर्ड के अंदर वो ये कि जी कोई मॉनेटरी टाइज ना हो, ठीक है, डायरेक्ट मॉनेटरी टाइज, लेकिन उसके अलावा बड़े कनेक्शंस होते हैं. यहाँ पे काफी सारी रिसर्च की गई है कि even though technically the directors were independent, but अगर आप उनके स्कूल के records खोलें या आप उनके golf clubs के records खोलें तो ये तो जी golfing करने जाते हैं या monetary ties उस तरह से नहीं है, but so they're not, they know each other, they're socially connected. जाके Facebook खोल लें उनका. और पाकिस्तान के अंदर I would imagine this is even more true because the business community is even more tightly knit. So the question of how independent the directors really are, well, who knows? And then sometimes even if they are, there is something called groupthink. आपके सामने आपका चेयर बैठा हुआ है जो कि 55 साल का है और वो आते ही अपना फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल रेज्यूमे खोल के बताते जी मैंने 10 साल यहाँ पे काम किया और मैंने 25 साल यहाँ पे काम किया, और आप अभी अपने स्टार्टअप के 30 साल के एग्जीक्यूटिव हैं और आपको सीट मिल गई है. देयर इज दिस टेंडेंसी टू सर आप जो कह रहे हैं शायद सही कह रहे होंगे, या दिस कॉल्ड ग्रुप थिंक, राइट? और जितना बड़ा ग्रुप होगा उसके अंदर देयर इज एन इंसेंटिव टू फ्री राइड कि हाँ बस जी बोर्ड के अंदर सीट तो मिल गई, बोर्ड के अंदर सीट मिल गई, बस मैं अपना सीवी बाहर दिखा दूं, हु केयर्स, चेयर है ना. अब देखिए ये these are very, अगर आप स्टूडेंट्स हैं you've probably experienced something of similar sort in group assignments कि बस free riding बहुत होती है. Boards are not any different. It's people. So my point is that you have to sort of understand that it's ultimately about at the end of the day these are all things that we can relate with because incentives and opportunities are just as true for businesses as they are for normal people. Complacent auditors सब कभी-कभार complacent होते हैं. आपका ऑडिटर है, आपका जो बिजनेस है आप उसके 10 साल से ऑडिटर लगे हुए हैं, आप किसी भी कंपनी के लिए 10 साल से काम कर रहे हैं, you establish connections, you establish rapport, और अगर आपका बड़ा क्लाइंट है you don't want to lose them, right? So auditors will like यार slap on the wrist, या आइंदा नहीं करना, ठीक है अभी तो मैं जाने दे. But that is where opportunity comes in, and that is when incentives and opportunity combine. That is where the problem arises, right? Now then you might say, okay, when that happens, how do firms do it? There are so many ways, and I again I'm like a whole different session, but I'll give you some examples. Recording revenue prematurely. So for आप revenue prematurely record करने, ठीक है, यानी पहले टाइम से पहले. जैसे ये this CEO of Sunbeam, Al Dunlap, got a reputation for this. So he would go to his customers. It was like, यार मुझे growth दिखानी है, मैं तुम्हें extra ये discounts देता हूँ, उसके कस्टमर कहते हैं भैया हम अगर चीज ले भी लें तो हमारे तो वेयर हाउस में जगह नहीं है, हमारे रिटेल आउटलेट्स में जगह नहीं, कहता उसकी फिक्र नहीं करो, आई विल बिल यू एंड देन आई विल होल्ड, राइट? So you need these grills 6 months from now. Don't worry about it. I'll bill you for these right now. I'll show greater growth in revenues this today. And then ये जो grills हैं या जो product है ये मैं अपने गोदाम में जाके रख लूंगा. I'll hold it on for you. Technically speaking, that sale was supposed to be recognized 6 months later. You are recording it prematurely, right? So that's one way to do it. Recording revenue that doesn't even exist. फैब्रिकेशन, आउटराइट फ्रॉड. आप कहेंगे यार ये अब कहाँ होता है, टाइम होता था जब होता होगा, लेकिन अब तो बड़े स्ट्रॉन्ग रेगुलेशंस आ गए हैं, इतने ऑडिटर्स होते हैं, मतलब आप फैब्रिकेट किस तरह से कर सकते हैं. एंड ल्यूकिन कॉफी की एग्जांपल बहुत रीसेंट है, यू नो, लेस देन अ ईयर अगो, इन फैक्ट अ फ्यू मंथ्स अगो, वेयर दे डिड एग्जैक्टली दैट, राइट? टोटली फैब्रिकेटेड सेल्स. वो अपनी इन स्टोर जो पर पर्सन जो सेल्स थी वो उसको उन्होंने एज मच एज ऑलमोस्ट 70% उसको इन्फ्लेट किया हुआ था. Wirecard, which is being referred to as the Enron of Europe, right? One of the biggest frauds in recent history and perhaps the biggest in Europe. Pretty much the same thing, right? Aap record aisa kar. Now, I have to admit, like for the अगर auditors इसको नहीं पकड़ पाते हैं तो एक retail investors के लिए चीज पकड़ना मुश्किल है, नामुमकिन नहीं है, लेकिन हो सकता है, but you need to then really get into the depth of it. अच्छा, ये बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग है, ये मैं पॉइंट जरूर मेंशन करना चाहूंगा. वन टाइम एडजस्टमेंट्स, ये मैंने और आप भी देखेंगे कि ये स्पेशली यंग फर्म्स या ग्रोइंग फर्म्स, जो फर्म्स अभी यू नो दे आर नियरिंग यू नो गोइंग पब्लिक और प्राइवेट, ये एडजस्टमेंट्स बड़ी करेंगी. सो आप देखेंगे कि कुछ होगा, जैसे नेट इनकम होगी, उसके बाद दनादन जी एडजस्टमेंट शुरू हो जाती है. देयर इज समथिंग कॉल्ड एडजस्टेड ईबिटा. Then WeWorks का आपने पता नहीं नाम सुना है कि नहीं, लेकिन WeWorks was a company which was basically leasing office spaces. They came up with something called a community adjusted EBITDA, जिसके अंदर वो basically वो इनकम से, नेट इनकम से स्टार्ट करते हैं, उसके कहते हैं वेल हमारे ये एक एडजस्टमेंट कर लें जी, क्योंकि ये वन टाइम थिंग थी, और ये भी एडजस्टमेंट कर लें. WeWorks went to the extent जहां पे उन्होंने कहा कि ये जो हम जो मार्केटिंग के जो एक्सपेंसेस कर रहे हैं, ये भी टेक्निकली जो है ना हमारी यू नो ये these are one time things, ये बाद में थोड़ी होंगी. तो उन्होंने they came up with community adjusted EBITDA. और एंड ये कंपनीज क्यों कर रही होती हैं, ये देखें, बड़ा गंभीर सा थोड़ा ये चक्कर होता है इसकी, क्योंकि आप जब एज अ फर्म जब आप बाहर जाते हैं टू रेज डेट, one of the things that the market actually looks at is that something called what is known as the debt to EBITDA multiple. So again, for some of you who are sort of new to this, बात बड़ी simple सी है. बैंक्स के पास आप जाएंगे, बैंक्स आपसे कहेंगे जी आपका EBITDA या earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization कितनी है, हम उसका 3 times या 4 times जो है ना आपको डेट दे देंगे to support your growth. ठीक है? Again, this is their way of assessing कि जी आपको कितना डेट देना चाहिए to support growth. So clearly जितना आपका ये नंबर ज्यादा होगा उतना आपको डेट मिलेगा. तो अगर आप अपनी ग्रोथ सपोर्ट करना चाह रहे हैं, so you would want to show an EBITDA which is well high. So then companies go to these lengths of making all sorts of adjustments. And the point that I want to make to you is that be very, very careful. These should actually be one time, and if the firm is making a lot of these one time adjustments, if you will, a lot, then you should be careful, because this is just a company's way of saying, like Uber ने अभी कल परसों ही अपनी कुछ earnings दिखाई हैं, and like उसके अंदर उन्होंने जी पूरा एक्सप्लेन किया कि जी हमारा एडजस्टेड EBITDA जो है ना वो कौन सी एडजस्टमेंट, एंड द कंपनीज गो टू सर्टेन लेंथ एक्सप्लेनिंग कि कौन सी हम एडजस्टमेंट्स कर रहे हैं. और आर्टिकल भी देखें, एंड में ये कहता है कि जी देखें cool, okay, but at the end the only takeaway you should have from this is that Uber Eats likely lost a lot more money without these core adjustments. That, I mean, all these adjustments are basically sort of a way to sort of signify. Emma, thank you. I'll maybe entertain your question in a bit. Let me, if you don't mind. Yeah, or maybe it's up to the moderator. I'm fine.
I think we can take the questions at the end. Sure. That'll be great.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. एडजस्ट, ये देखिए U2U एक कंपनी थी, उन्होंने अपनी एडजस्टेड EBITDA को एक्सप्लेन करने के लिए ये मैं पूरा पेज डॉक्यूमेंट फिल नहीं कर सका. ये आपको शायद नजर नहीं आए, और ये आर्टिकल में बड़ा इंटरेस्टिंग पढ़ रहा था कि they basically try to do research on how much word count people spend on just explaining कि adjusted EBITDA के अंदर क्या क्या adjustments हैं. There are some companies which use more than 1,000 to 1,500 words. Just for context, US का Declaration of Independence के अंदर 1,500 से कम लफ्ज हैं. तो कुछ कंपनी जो है वो उसको भी पार कर जाती हैं. तो again, my main point is that be wary of that. Shifting expenses to a later period. This is another way in which companies do this. So आपके बहुत सारे जी मार्केटिंग एक्सपेंसेस हैं और या R&D के कुछ एक्सपेंसेस हैं और आप कहते हैं कि जी यार अगर मैंने इनको दिखा दिया तो मेरी तो नेट इनकम बड़ी कम आ जाएगी. तो मैं लेकिन ये टेक्निकली तो मैं इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रहा हूँ जी अपने बिजनेस के अंदर. मार्केटिंग ये तो इन्वेस्टमेंट है. R&D ये तो मैं एक इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रहा हूँ. तो आप क्या करें, आप जो टेक्निकली द स्टफ दैट नीड्स टू बी एक्सपेंस्ड यू कैपिटलाइज इट, मीनिंग आप उसको एसेट शो कर दें और फिर उसके अगेंस्ट डिप्रिसिएशन रिकॉर्ड करना शुरू कर. सो इम्प्रॉपर कैपिटलाइजेशन ऑफ लाइन कॉस्ट. उससे क्या होगा, दो चीजें, आप एक्सपेंसेस को कम दिखा रहे हैं और आप साथ में ये दिखा रहे हैं जी हमारे तो एसेट्स ग्रो कर रहे हैं. सो दिस इज again, it sounds like this doesn't happen. WorldCom did the same thing. AOL did the exact same thing with their marketing and solicitation costs. This was back in the days, but it happens. And look, I want to come back almost like full circle back to the point that I was making earlier on in the seminar, which was that if you had instead focused on cash flows, not earnings. देखें अगर ऑपरेटिंग एक्सपेंस आपने अपने कम कर दिए, ठीक है, टू शो हायर अर्निंग्स, तो आप क्या दिखा रहे हैं? आप दिखा रहे हैं कि जी हमने इन्वेस्टमेंट की है एसेट्स के अंदर. ये एक्सपेंस नहीं थे तो एसेट्स के अंदर इन्वेस्टमेंट थी. वेल, अगर आप सिर्फ अर्निंग्स के ऊपर फोकस कर रहे होंगे तो आप कहेंगे जी वाह अर्निंग्स बड़ी ज्यादा है. लेकिन अगर ये एसेट्स के अंदर इन्वेस्टमेंट है तो वो कैश फ्लो स्टेटमेंट में रिफ्लेक्ट हो जाएगी, राइट? बिकॉज आपके ऑपरेटिंग कैश फ्लोस तो चले एक तरफ हैं, लेकिन आप फिर ये दिखा रहे हैं कि जी कैपेक्स के अंदर या इन्वेस्ट फाइनेंसिंग एक्टिविटीज बहुत ज्यादा हैं, ठीक है. और अगर आपने देयरफॉर फ्री कैश फ्लो में इस दौरान जैसे वर्ल्डकॉम के ऊपर फोकस किया होता तो आप नोटिस करते कि फ्री कैश फ्लो 1999 में उनका 2.2 बिलियन था. It dropped from 2.2 to a negative 3.8, almost a $6 billion drop in 1 year. Now, when something as radical as this happens, then again, you know, you're like, wait a minute, what's going on? What happened? Probe it. Okay? You would think it's obvious, right? Well, it's clearly not, right? So focus on cash flows is the key part. So I'll maybe spend a couple of minutes on like my general advice. Try to, like, when you are probing these businesses, first try to identify what quote unquote suspect businesses might be. So here you have to appreciate उनके incentives क्या है और opportunity है कि नहीं, right? Incentives उनके पास होगा उन businesses का which are very pressured to show like sustained high growth, ठीक है? Especially young firms which are VC backed. Okay, this is somewhat debatable, लेकिन on the one hand you would expect कि VCs हैं वो, you know, जैसे कहते हैं ना, smart money है, they will be more aggressive in monitoring and everything. You'd be surprised because a lot of VCs are in there to make money and sometimes they overlook things. एक यंग VC फंड है, उसका मकसद है कि यार हमने अपने लोगों से पैसे लिए, इस बिजनेस के अंदर इन्वेस्ट किया, हमें बस इसको अब निकालना है, या तो इसका IPO कर दें कंपनी का या इसको किसी और एडवांस्ड VC फर्म को बेचें and then get out. So if you have like VC firms and businesses play this game a lot in which they sort of they do this dance together sometimes, and again, you know, like some are better than others, but you have to understand the incentives. Okay, you have to understand the incentives. Agar VC firm is there for the short term, this means that they are not going to be very cautious about what they're looking at least for the long-term investors. So you have to do your due diligence, you have to do your homework. For those firms which have high analyst investor expectations, firms whose value is mostly coming from growth assets, tangible kuch nahi hai, jaise Uber, very few tangible assets, because a lot of it is on growth. Tesla is more or less in the same boat, not quite, but जितने intangibles होंगे firm के पास, इसका मतलब है कि उतना valuation जो है ना वो it's subject to opinions. So be careful over there, because a lot of the pricing that is happening is on growth. And then firms which have weak governance. So these are your suspect businesses. And then my advice to you then would be to then read the reports, read informed research. I know Ali and his team are doing a bang up job of actually filling that information gap. So I'm so on KASB, I think that they've put together financials for you to look. Look, it requires an effort. आप एक बिजनेस के अंदर इन्वेस्ट करें. आप खुद सोचें, अगर आप अपने बिजनेस में इन्वेस्ट करते तो आप बस सोचे समझे बगैर थोड़ी जाते. आप जब स्टॉक खरीद रहे होते हैं, आप एक बिजनेस के अंदर ओनरशिप ले रहे हैं, उस बिजनेस को समझने की कोशिश करें. ठीक है, फाइनेंशियल्स पढ़ें. वॉरेन बफेट टू दिस डे स्पेंड्स मोस्ट ऑफ हिज टाइम रीडिंग फाइनेंशियल्स फ्रॉम कवर टू कवर. Okay, so and he does his own work, right? So I'd encourage you to do the same. There is something very, very important often in the footnotes. आप सिर्फ बैलेंस शीट इनकम स्टेटमेंट नहीं दीजिए, footnotes भी देखें. Analysts बहुत सारे आएंगे. हमारी expectation ये है जी, हमारी expectation ये. Look, some research is better than others, but research clearly shows that analysts tend to be biased upwards. There are very few analysts who make it by making calls on like sell this asset. Because they're on the sell side. Again, come to incentives. They're on the sell side mostly, a lot of them. And when you're on a sell side, you're trying to sell a company, you're going to say buy it, right? So there is clear research which shows that on average, not all, but on average, analysts' forecasts tend to be optimistic, and so they tend to revise them downwards. And much of the evidence lately across the world has shown that don't place too much trust in even auditors, because as we've seen in the wake of some of the recent crises. Now, if this sounds like too much work, this is my final slide, then my general advice would be then become passive investor. Do invest, but do so passively. And what I mean by that is, diversify. आप कह रहे हैं मैं एक कंपनी दो कंपनी में कौन पड़े इतना. So then diversify across a broad base of firms. Make staggered investments. अगर आप 1 करोड़ रुपए है तो 1 करोड़ इकट्ठा नहीं लगा दें, but stage करें उसको. And then stay in for the long haul, because passive investment does outperform active investing over the long term, right? So there's that. So there's that. So with that, I'm happy to.
Thank you, Atif. Thank you so much for giving that detailed presentation. I'm 100% sure me, including a lot of people, learned a lot from it. It was refresher, and it was definitely going to help a lot of people. So now let's go to the questions. So the first question that I got is that you showed a slide in which you said कि जो cash conversion cycle जिसकी होती है, जिसकी improvement होती है, तो वो जाहिर सी बात they outperform in the long run जो आपने दिखाई थी. So there's a question from a gentleman. He's saying that what if that stock has a higher PE ratio? So I'm assuming that the answer would be in that case कि अगर एक stock है उसका high PE है, तो does that necessarily mean अगर वो ऊपर fall भी करता है कि it's not undervalued and it is worth investing? A quick question.
Yeah, no, that's so I come across this question about PE ratio a lot. मेरे बहुत सारे दोस्त हैं जो कि उनका पहला स्क्रीन ही ये होता है, let's identify firms with a low PE ratio. क्योंकि आप basically it is sort of like symbolic of like undervalued, like आपकी price जो है compared to your earnings is low. I want you to be very cautious about this line of thinking. देखिए, PE ratio low होने का मतलब necessarily ये नहीं है कि company is undervalued, and a high PE ratio by the same logic does not necessarily mean that the company is overvalued. So PE ratio, all that is really telling you is how the market is pricing respect to earnings. If a company has good growth prospects, if a firm has good cash flow prospects going forward, it will have a high PE ratio, and it could still be undervalued because that PE ratio may be low compared to what its growth prospects look like. देखिए, PE ratio को देखने के दो तरीके हैं. एक तो आप कहें कि जी low PE ratio है, undervalued है, ये एक नजरिया है. लेकिन दूसरा नजरिया ये है कि price is low for a reason. मैं आपको classic example उसकी Amazon और eBay है. Amazon का और eBay का PE ratio, you might say, well, firms in the same industry should have a similar PE ratio. No, absolutely not. Okay, Amazon ka PE ratio is way more. I think exceeds 60 or 70 in more recent times. Or jo eBay ka, in contrast, is less than 20. It boils down to growth prospects. Okay, so my point, I guess, here is this: PE ratio in itself is not an appropriate measure to screen investments. Even if the firm has a high PE ratio, it could still be a profitable investment, because you're saying that it could warrant, given its particular growth prospects, an even higher PE ratio. So I guess that's the point. And I think you were making.
Thank you. So I think Atif also wanted to emphasize here that don't fall into the value trap. If a stock is cheaper, there might be reason for that. So the next question is coming from Gibran. Gibran, I'm going to unmute you if you can ask the question right now.
Hello.
Ji, Japan.
Yeah. Hi. I just want to ask that we have had companies, like in the US, as you got that name of that car manufacturer. How do you see that stock, Yani, like in the short term and in the long term? Yani, like we have seen that I feel that the stock has increased by more than, I think, 4 or 5 times, like in the last 1 year or so. So and at the same time we like as such, like profits. So how do you see that company's balance sheet as compared to its current, I should say, stock price?
So I will have to be somewhat cautious of these very company-specific sort of questions. I do, because I don't want to impart like very specific advice. I think because I'll openly admit I don't have the time myself to individually screen stocks and everything. So I'm a passive investor, and I'm in there for the long run. So I invest in sectors. I don't do companies per se. That said, I think Tesla is in somewhat of a similar spot as a lot of these growth companies, where you'll hear arguments on both sides of the coin. By a lot of look with Tesla, I think what you're really buying is the founder. I think I'll put it this way: it really just depends on how much you believe in Elon Musk and his vision. Because if he is able to fulfill on that, then by that means I think the stock is undervalued in that regard, because he has a lot of ambitious goals, and if he achieves them, then especially the direction in which the market is going, you could very well see this stock approach $3,000. But that really depends on how much you believe in Elon Musk and his ability to follow through, because it is still a business which requires a lot of investment or reinvestment, I'd say. And so if he's not able to sort of, given his eccentric self, able to follow through on that, then by that token, I feel it's kind of pricey, or at the very least fairly valued. I think that's the extent to which I'll comment on that.
Thank you on that. So the next question is from Kamran. Kamran, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Ji, I can hear you.
Thanks for the good presentation. I've got 2 questions. The first one is around the overall assessment of the stock positions, the couple of funds which are linked with equity, with other bonds as well. How you do the evaluation of those funds, the way you are doing for the companies. And secondly, have you got any template or Excel model which you can share with us so we can populate it? And then if we need to do analysis, just by the best data, we can get the outcome from those templates. And the third thing, which I'm very interested, I work in the UK markets. There are a lot of companies who got a lot of work to do around these evaluations of the SMEs and the big companies, and they are looking for some partnership in other countries, specifically in India and Pakistan. what is the market out there in Pakistan at the moment to offer such services?
Okay, so I'll try. I think for the last question, I think Mr. Sumro here and Ali Khwja might be people who might give you a better sense for how the market looks out there. I think they have a better pulse on the economic environment over there. So I'd sort of ask you to, or I'd revert that question over to those gentlemen. I wasn't sure I fully understood your first question about evaluating the performance of, did you say funds, was it?
Yeah, it was the funds, like for example, if this is the gilt index or these are the stock or equity index overall, which is obviously the bucket of the whole companies. We don't go financial statements of individual company.
So Skindar, I mean, there's a lot of different asset pricing models. I mean, this really is as an exercise in data crunching, to be honest. So you have a lot of quants or quantitative researchers who actually take a lot of the data on how the stock or the fund has performed over time. They'll try to compare it with a benchmark, with a diversified portfolio, and try to see how much of an alpha has it generated. And again, an alpha is basically a measure of abnormal performance. And then again, there are different types of asset pricing models out there. Again, I think you would need to get a team or outsource it to somebody who can actually implement these pricing models and try to understand what the abnormal performance is of these funds. So it can be done, but it requires a lot of work with data, if you will. With respect to your second question, so I don't, I mean, I do my own analysis. I do have some Excel stuff, but I'm very, I don't, and this is not because I don't want to share my stuff. It's just because first of all, it's some, I understand that stuff better because I've constructed it, but I can tell you that there's one professor at NYU, his name is Aswat Damodaran. You can look him up. He has a lot of Excel sheets. And in fact, he has also more recently constructed an app. It's called Value U. Look it up. I'm sure if you look it up on the internet, what he's done is that he's tried to basically convert some of his Excel sheets into these, into an app where if you have certain inputs, you can feed them into these templates and it will output a value. And he would tell you the same thing. While it is useful to have these templates, I think people, like, it's a very slippery slope, because what ends up happening then is you become very focused on the output that comes out, and then you don't understand the machinery. And you have to understand that a lot of these Excel models, a lot of this financial modeling for that matter, is a function of the inputs that are going into the model, right? So the model is a model. It'll output based on inputs. The key, the absolute key, is that you have an understanding of the inputs. I'll give you a very simple example. If you'll take an Excel template and put 5% growth, this much retention and all that, it'll say, okay, this much value. What's your justification for 5% growth? Now that is something that Excel can't do for you. That is no financials. So you would still need to go deeper into the financial statements, do your research, and then ask yourself, what is a reasonable growth rate that I can expect for this one? So I'm not saying that you shouldn't use these apps or Excel sheets, but I would don't rely on them overly, because this happens. I've seen this happen one too many times. You become too fixated on the model itself. Garbage in, garbage out. You have to focus on what your inputs are. That's much more important.
Thank you.
I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, thank you, Atif. Thank you for that. There's a next question from Awais Khan. Awais, I'm going to unmute you. Please go ahead.
हेलो सलाम सर, कैन यू हियर मी सर?
जी
Yes, we can.
सबसे पहले आतिफ सर, आप बहुत अच्छा से बता रहे हैं, तो मेरे सिर्फ 2 क्वेश्चन है आपसे। एक क्वेश्चन ये कि सर जैसे अभी हमने हेडलाइंस के अंदर देखा कि पाकिस्तान स्टॉक मार्केट अभी एशिया की बेस्ट मार्केट परफॉर्म कर दी है, तो हमारे पास ऐसे हमने कौन से फिगर्स इसके देखेंगे हम लोग को ऐसे प्रिडिक्ट पता चले कि पाकिस्तान स्टॉक मार्केट या कोई भी स्टॉक मार्केट आगे जाके अच्छा परफॉर्म कर सकती है पूरी स्टॉक मार्केट को अगर देखा जाए 100 इंडेक्स वगैरह। एंड सेकंड क्वेश्चन था कि व्हाट इज द बेस्ट मेथड ऑफ टेस्टिंग फॉर द एसेट मिसप्राइसिंग फाइनेंशियल मार्केट?
अच्छा, तो पहला जो आपका सवाल है उसके अंदर तो, एंड आई थिंक अली, फरीद एंड मिस्टर सुमरो हियर, आई थिंक they are in much better position to answer that question. So if you don't mind, I'll loosely revert that question to them, because I think they have, and they are doing a phenomenal job doing all sorts of research on macroeconomic indicators. उसके अंदर काफी सारी चीजें आ जाती हैं, future outlook, a lot of, so very loosely speaking, I think that is a function of where you feel the macro economy is headed. What is how do you foresee foreign direct investment? How do you see all the trade activity? How do you see inflation going forward? All of these play a role, and I think people who are on the ground over there are much better positioned to answer that question. So if you don't mind, but very loosely speaking, I think it has to do a lot with where you're seeing the economy headed in terms of macroeconomics. One thing that, and again, this is going more on the quant side, but I think ये आपके इस दूसरे question में भी feed कर रहा है. There is something called, आपने capital asset pricing model का तो सुना होगा, like जो simple CAPM है, लेकिन उसके अलावा there are many other factor models. Farmer and French 3-factor model है, Farmer and French 4-factor model भी है. Factor models basically करते क्या हैं? They try to identify factors that can explain expected returns on stocks. So जैसे आपने pricing की बात की ना, तो वही है. तो in a very textbookish sense, not textbookish, but in a more mainstream is something called the beta. ठीक है, आपने beta of the stock capital asset pricing model पढ़ लिया, beta. लेकिन turns out that beta cannot explain everything, at least in many developed and developing countries as well. For example, there is something called a size premium, जिसके अंदर अगर company smaller है तो people expect a certain higher expected rate of return from it. इसी तरह there is something called a momentum factor. There is something called value premium. So ये इस तरह के, so the different factors. हम quantitative research के अंदर घुस सकते हैं इसके अंदर, but it turns out कि वो जो हम macroeconomic जो बहुत सारे indicators की हम बात कर रहे हैं ना, जैसे what if inflation is this, what if the अगर deficit अगर इतना हुआ तो फिर expected returns क्या होंगे. It turns out that a lot of the information that is contained in those macroeconomic variables can be brought down into 2 or 3 or 4 factors, and there is continued academic research happening on what are those factors that explain expected returns. I think CAPM was 30, 35 years ago, but over time research has evolved. So what I would encourage you to do, if you're so inclined, कि आप पढ़ें on some of the research that has been done on these different asset pricing models. CAPM it's old news actually. और फिर वहां से फिर आप अगर आप उनको समझ जाएंगे उन factors को, तो I think you'll be able to sort of do your own data analysis and see whether the market is mispriced or not. And that is a, I don't want to say an easy exercise, but it's something that you can learn and you can do on your own. And I think there's value to it. हम maybe तफसील से बाद में इसके बारे में बात कर सकते हैं on maybe like out of this call.
Absolutely. Awais, you are more than welcome to contact us. Contact me directly on LinkedIn or Twitter. We can have this conversation later on in detail. Our website, kasb.com, our blog is also there. We are very much accessible. And I think for the sake of this webinar, we'll take the last question from Ayman Abdullah. Ayman, you are unmute right now. Please go ahead if you are there with us.
जी अस्सलाम वालेकुम. मेरा सवाल है आतिफ साहब के लिए. Atif Saab, how do you see, abhi aapne, in response to COVID, you've seen the US and the West in general resume QE, and how do you see that affecting, say, the dollar, and how do you see the dollar, a stronger or weaker dollar, affecting Pakistan and emerging markets?
तो ये सवाल again there are different opinions on it. QE in general we expect to lead to inflationary pressures. We are seeing that over here in some extent, but because of the extraordinarily low interest rate environment, I think that's not perpetuating the system as much as people thought, and so that's actually lending into question a lot of this sort of standard monetary policy interventions and the ramifications. But I do, again, this is my personal opinion, I do see the dollar losing ground in the future just because of this quantitative easing. And in fact, we have seen some evidence of that in recent times where dollar has been sort of wavering and sort of headed in a slightly downward trajectory. I expect a little bit more of that in the future. This is, again, my personal opinion. Frankly speaking, I think it's slightly out of my domain as well, and not outrightly, but I think that goes more into, lot more into macroeconomics than I feel qualified to talk about. Ali, again, I don't want to keep on sort of deflecting questions to Ali, but I know Ali has done some phenomenal work in this area, has a lot of experience with this, and talks to is connected with a lot of people who actually do this stuff. So he may perhaps give you an even more informed answer than I am. But yeah, I think very loosely speaking, we will see some inflationary pressures here and a slightly more devaluation.
Thank you, Atif. We would conclude the questions. We have run out of the questions. I'll just like to ask the last question from my side before we end this conversation. And thank you everybody. In Pakistan, we have seen a lot of companies do not pay dividends per se to that profile. So Pakistan is a cyclical market. We see early cycle and the late cycle. How important it is for investors to like the company which consistently pays dividends to the minority shareholders. And in my experience, I've seen that they trade at a slightly higher valuation, even in bad times when the markets are collapsing, because people don't want to let go of it because they have a 15-year history. So if you could conclude on the utility of paying dividends to the minority shareholders, whatever percentage ratio it is, but what does it reflect about the management if it's continuously paying dividends at a moderate level also? And does that help increase in valuation?
No, that's a great question. I think so in general, if your company is paying consistent dividends, that is usually indicative of a company which is somewhat mature. It feels like it doesn't need a lot of money to go back into reinvestment. So you'll see a lot of growth firms having very low dividends, if any dividends, and then eventually they come out and start paying dividends. So again, there are many factors that go into this, but generally speaking, I'd say that those firms which are paying consistent dividends and their steady growth, I think there is a level of certainty there in terms of what you're going to get. Most of the return that you're expecting to make on those investments is basically from the dividend yield, and these companies typically have like a low growth part associated with them, because by definition they're then sending this signal that, look, we are a mature company, we can afford to give dividends. So there's that. I think the higher valuation that you're seeing in Pakistan for these firms, I would be surprised if I see that on average the PE ratios of these firms are on the higher end compared to more growth-oriented firms, because that usually you don't see. But I think there is a signaling effect associated with the dividends as well, where you're trying to cater to a sort of a clientele, if you will, which cares about dividends, and these people therefore are like, they have a preference. They just happen to have a preference for firms which pay dividends. And so because of that added preference, for whatever reason, maybe increased certainty, maybe more stability, they're just valuing it higher. So I would think that would be something that is at play over there. But in general, I think there is this whole value versus growth sort of dichotomy in these different asset classes. That your growth firms, by definition, are not going to have a lot of dividends, and there you're going to see a lot of the valuation coming from, well, future growth prospects. And likewise, the more value firms are going to be more on the dividend side of things. I'm unsure if I answered your question.
Absolutely, you're spot on. You're spot on. Yeah. So the signaling effect, and yes, the profile of the sponsors also make a difference to the management strategy and the board strategy. Thank you, Atif. Thank you for taking time out for us. Thank you everybody for joining in. Thank you everybody for asking questions. This session would be available on our websites, on our Facebook, and on our LinkedIn and Twitter pages also. We hope to learn more from you, Atif, next time also. And I hope everybody learned something from it. Thank you so much. Thank you so
very
much,
much.
guys.
It was a pleasure to be here. Allah Hafiz.
Take care. Allah Hafiz. Thank you so much.
Sure.